People gave him a mandate because they thought that he was going to be better for the economy. And if he follows through on a lot of these different things, he's got people out there saying that it's not going to lead to inflation. If it doesn't lead to inflation, I'll come back and I'll eat my hat on your show.
Hi, I'm Ed D'Agostino from Malden Economics, and this week we take a deep dive into geopolitics, including the ripple effects of U.S. tariff threats, Europe's role in the Russia-Ukraine war, and which countries might fare best if the U.S. and China's relationship continues to get worse. My friend Jacob Shapiro is one of my favorite geopolitical analysts. He's the director of research at Bespoke Group and a popular speaker to corporate boards, trade groups, and conferences, and he's my guest today on Global Macro Update. Jacob, I've been trying to figure out how to approach this interview for days now. I think maybe we start with a slightly different twist on tariffs. I think tariffs are really confusing a lot of people and frustrating a lot of people, especially investors, with the whipsawing that's happening. I think the goal is resiliency, American resiliency. That's the stated goal of these tariffs. But there's ripple effects. And I want to get into sort of the maybe unintended consequences that you see happening from tariffs, even if they aren't implemented, just the policies that are being discussed right now. What do you see happening outside the U.S. in terms of trade and behavior?
It's a huge question, and there's a lot of different levels to break it down at. I also think tariffs mean different things for different countries. Like Canada and steel and aluminum tariffs mean different things for Canada, mean different things for the EU, mean different things for China. And one of the unfortunate things about tariffs is that they are blunt instruments. It's really hard to, you can use a tariff surgically, but that's not how the Trump administration chooses to use it. They wield it as a blunt object, and they just go around hammering people or threatening to hammer people. I think you're also right to point out there's the threat versus the actual implementation. So like sometimes President Trump is just throwing tariffs around and then nothing ends up happening because you carve out an exclusion or you get down to the last minute and he claims that, oh, no, they did something, so now I pull them off versus what's different. I think the way to approach this at least is there is a pattern that is emerging, which is he threatens tariffs. Countries give him something that he wants, that he claims is a victory, and then he backs off. Or at least that was up until the steel and aluminum tariffs. That's how things were working. The steel and aluminum tariffs, I think, go back to something he was doing in his first term. And there, it seems he obviously just has this idea that the U.S. should make steel and aluminum itself and that industry needs to be protected. That's all well and good, and you can make a good faith policy argument for that happening. There's just a couple problems. The reason that steel in particular, I'll use steel because I know that market a little better than aluminum. The reason that steel prices collapsed over the last couple of decades is because China produces so much of it. And they use a ton of it too, but then whatever they didn't use, they were just dumping on the global market. I think it was Visual Capitalist that had that incredible chart that like China in 3 years produced more steel than the British Empire consumed in 100 years or something like that. The figures are astronomical. And unless you're going to go back in time and fix China's dumping of steel into global markets, you're probably not going to fix that much for the American steel producer because prices are just that low. And by the way, that's good for everybody except the steel producer. So it's good for the airlines, and it's good for the car companies, and it's good for the tech guys, and it's good for the data centers, and it's good for real estate. It is nice to have cheap steel and cheap aluminum. It makes everything really, really cheap. And if you want to protect the U.S. steel and aluminum industries, not only do you have to protect the U.S. producers, you probably need to subsidize the U.S. producers themselves because they've been in pain for decades and they probably can't get competitive or get up and produce at a level that needs to be produced down the road. All of which we're meandering. I think all of this goes to the mandate that President Trump was elected with. It was the economy, stupid, as my fellow Louisianian James Carville liked to say around the Clinton administration. People gave him a mandate because they thought that he was going to be better for the economy. And if he follows through on a lot of these different things, he's got people out there saying that it's not going to lead to inflation. If it doesn't lead to inflation, I'll come back and I'll eat my hat on your show. But like all of these things lead to higher prices. And so at some point, you got to think he's going to get an inflation print that he doesn't like, and the market is going to tank. And he'll probably find a way to weasel out of all these things. But the damage will have been done because you'll have all these retaliatory tariffs on the books, and you'll have countries that are making decisions about how they can protect their industries and open up trade relations with other countries outside the United States. And unless you are one of these countries like Canada or like Mexico, where you have literally no choice, you have no option because you are so dependent on the United States, probably you'll see these other countries start sniffing around. Well, what does Beijing have to say? What does India look like? Maybe there's something coming out of Brussels that's interesting. Like, all that conversation is going to happen and accelerate. So a meandering response to your question, but that's at least where I would start thinking about it.
Let me take the other side of the argument.
Please.
It wasn't necessarily the economy that Trump was handed a mandate around. It was more about American resiliency, right? It was more about, and I think this goes back to COVID, when we saw, it was laid bare just how dependent the United States had become on other countries for pretty much everything, right? Pharmaceuticals, personal protective equipment. We couldn't get masks, right? What was there were two manufacturers in the world that made the sticks that were used for the end of a cotton swab to swab, right? And they were both in Italy, of all places, two of them in Italy. And then there's kind of the obvious, China, right? Like you talk about China, making massive amounts of steel and then dumping it on the world. You can point to so many other industries that they've done that to, where basically if they enter an industry, Louis Gobb said this to me last week. So, China enters an industry and they destroy the margins. That's just what they do. They destroy margins for everyone else. Nobody else can compete. And on the one hand, that's awesome, right? That we can buy $2 t-shirts in the United States. Fantastic. Well, in what world should a t-shirt actually cost $2? I mean, we can't make $2 t-shirts, and who cares? But there's other things that we become so dependent on outside countries, some of which maybe are not our friends. And then if they shut that spigot off, we're exposed. So that's the other side of the argument from my perspective. What do you say to that?
There's a disconnect between that, which is a totally reasonable argument, and the policies that we're seeing. So you're 100% right. The United States does not make things anymore. We forgot how to make things in this country. And that's normal, by the way, for civilizations. Like, people today don't know how they made the pyramids. It's such a mystery that some people literally argue that aliens made the pyramids because we have no clue how they did it. A more recent example, medieval Gothic cathedrals in Europe. We don't know how stonemasons actually manufactured the stones with the tools that they had to do that. We don't know. We forgot. The United States has forgotten how to make lots of things. So we don't, you mentioned pharmaceuticals. We're still dependent on China and India for most of the generics. That dependence keeps on going up. I have a slide deck of 20 different slides for the things we're dependent on. Ships, we make less than 2% of the ships that are commissioned every single year in the world. Who cares if we have the best 250 ships and the most modern equipped navy in the world? China can produce them by the thousand. So if we get into a shooting conflict in the South China Sea and they just roll out 1,000 ships after 1,000 ships, and we're spending how many billion on every single perfect one, and they just kamikaze it out, to mix my metaphors, it's not going to work. Semiconductors, we don't make semiconductors in this country. It's a highly intricate supply chain that involves everybody from the Dutch to Taiwan to South Korea and Japan, and you're not going to fix that overnight. I thought the most successful thing the Trump administration did in its first term, and it was incredible, they never got the credit for this, was Operation Warp Speed. There was a pandemic. We didn't know how bad it was going to be at the time. It's easy in hindsight to say that everything, wasn't as deadly as everybody. Okay, like, I remember in the moment, it was really, really scary. And they got heads of industry together and they said, fix this. Bring this to market as quickly as possible. Let's do it. And it was done. And we had a vaccine in a record amount of time. If they want to do the types of things you're talking about with resilience, they need Operation Warp Speed for U.S. shipbuilding and for semiconductors and for pharma and for anything else that qualifies as strategic. And yes, you're going to have to eat the higher prices on that because things are going to cost more as a result. But maybe if you put the shoulder of the U.S. government behind it, you can grow your way out of that because you're going to have such tremendous growth and you're going to have the U.S. government behind it. I used Operation Warp Speed as a result. You can think about the space program as a time that the United States did this, what the United States has done in wartime, like World Wars I and World War II. That's not what's happening. There's an internal knife fight in the Trump administration between guys who are saying they're going to be fiscal conservatives and cut spending versus the guys who want to do the Operation Warp Speeds versus the guys who want to go after China for being the evil communists and sort of everything else in between. So you're 100% right. Like, there's an argument to be made there for resilience. The only thing I would really push back at you on is just, I do think it was about the economy. If you go back and look at Gallup polling or Pew polling or anybody else, everybody's election polls were really, really tight. But if you go and you look at people, you asking them on specific issues, do you think, who do you think would do better managing the economy? Trump had Kamala beat by 9 or 10%. And that result, I think, was so I think that people are thinking that Trump is going to manage the economy better. And he's in this situation where, well, I don't know if he's in this situation, because he also, nothing seems to stick to him. Like, he can do the complete opposite of what he said before, and then everybody hails it as, oh, it's brilliant, and he's keeping his promises. Like, nothing actually sticks. So maybe inflation will go up, and he can say, oh, this is still all Biden's fault, and people will actually believe him. But I do think he's gonna get off this honeymoon period, and if he follows through on some of these things, it's going to cause economic pain for the U.S. consumer. And is he going to stick to his guns? Is he really going to double down on these tariffs things to get back to that conversation? Because if he does what he says he's going to do, the only thing I see in our future is higher prices. If he does what you say, if it's a full government effort behind increasing government resilience and capacity in the United States around critical industries, great. Sign me up, and the United States is going to blow off top growth. You haven't seen anything yet, but that's not what we're getting out of Washington. Nothing close.
I do hope that they make a pivot. I mean, like the whole thing behind Elon Musk and Doge. Great, get rid of the waste. I'm sure there's a ton of it. Anyone who's worked for the government that I've spoken with will come back and say, oh yeah, there's a lot of waste and a lot of wasted time and a lot of redundancy and just, red tape that could be streamlined out. Great. Love it. But I worry that they're focused too much on culture wars and that they're going to overplay their hand when really, if they made a pivot to an expanded Operation Warp Speed, boy, what a glorious outcome that could be. I totally agree with you. That's a great point.
Look, Musk was not given any mandate because he's unelected. He's an unelected rogue running around the government, breaking things all over the place. Like, it doesn't make any sense. If you think about the institutional resilience of the United States, what Elon Musk is doing is actually fairly disturbing. And he's going after you're right, there's government waste. One man's redundancy is also another man's resilience, by the way. But fine, cut all the waste in general. You're going to do that by just killing USAID overnight? You're going to stop non-talk about the woke mind virus, and you're going to bring us into South African domestic politics and all. Okay, this is not what the normal American cares about. Maybe you can get away with it in these, couple first weeks of the administration because there's this blitz on everything else. But I think that's more of an indictment of the United States not being able to pivot and do the things that it wants to do. And I'm sure that China is just leaning back in its chair thinking, man, all that Marxist philosophy was right. The dialectic as well. Materialism is slowly destroying our enemy from the inside. Let's just be quiet and put on some tariffs on U.S. energy, which we don't import anyway, and just watch the show as the United States tears itself apart. So, and also, and last thing, Elon Musk's car company, Tesla, the Chinese are lapping him. BYD is going to complete, and Musk is probably the first one who wants U.S. protectionism and tariffs and things like that because he's not going to be able to compete with some of these other Chinese companies. So there's so many conflicts of interest there before you even get into it that it's also disturbing. So yeah, I'm with you. And I think it's worth, I try to be apolitical. I think calling out Elon Musk is not apolitical because the guy was not elected. I don't know what he's doing, and I'm not really clear why the U.S. government institutions have taken so long to rein him in. He'll get reined in eventually. He's not going to be able to just break things forever.
He's running a new government department. Most government departments aren't run by elected officials.
But has he been appointed? Has he been confirmed? Who approved the government department, and what powers do they have, and what authorities do they have? We have no answers to any of these questions. It's just completely out there, and he will get a nice interaction with the U.S. judicial system, I'm sure, as people start challenging these things in courts and things get turned back. It's bad for government efficiency. legions of lawyers challenging every single move that you're making in these early stages so that we won't actually be able to follow through. We'll just be litigating these moves for the next 10 years. Wow, what a great job of saving U.S. resources. The only people rejoicing about all this should be the lawyers, all the business they're going to get as a result.
I'm sure they are. And that's the one part about all this that makes me truly nervous is the potential for a constitutional crisis around legal rulings that aren't followed and what happens next. That is truly the scary part, I think.
Well, and to your point, like whether it's scary or not, like maybe I'm too blasé about this, but that's a long way away from how do you protect U.S. resilience in a multipolar world where we have rivals on all of our sides. It took all of 10 minutes in the podcast to go from, great plans to how are we going to work out the internal problems just from the guy who's supposed to be cutting the fat off of the budget. It's not a whole force of government effort quite yet. It's just kind of a dog and pony show for now.
Well, let's talk about the impact outside of the U.S., right? You brought up China, right? I mean, China's, I think, just as driven to boost resiliency as the U.S. is, going about it in a different way. They're a huge market. What happens to the rest of the world as China and the U.S. seemingly continue to push farther and farther apart from each other? Does the Middle East move towards China? Does China become the dominant influencer in the Middle East? What are the ripple effects here?
Let's see how far the United States and China trade war goes. My analysis right now is I don't think Beijing wants a trade war. And I think Beijing will be willing to make a deal with the Trump administration. And I think our first signal from the Trump administration, day one in office, he did not slap the 60% tariffs on China. Instead, he said, let's launch an investigation into whether they met their phase one trade deal requirements. Let's call Elon here. You don't need an investigation. They didn't. The data is easily available. Like they did not meet their requirements. And so that was the first signal of negotiation. He put those tariffs on, the 10% ones. China responded with some tariffs on things that they really don't import from the United States and say they have a call set up with Trump. It seems to me like, China's trying to play this so that they get some kind of deal because they have bigger fish to fry. Xi Jinping is sitting on economic problems that I'm sure you guys, we've talked about it before, and I'm sure other guests have come on and talked about it. We don't have to beat the dead horse there. But there's massive wealth inequality in China. Xi has to somehow transfer that wealth from the coast to the interior without, A, the wealthy cadres coming for his head, and B, setting off a peasant revolution. He's got the worst job in the world. I wouldn't want to be him at all. You've got the Chinese government. The Chinese government is the one that is trying to stick up for free trade. They just today, the State Council published this new plan to encourage foreign investment and encourage the stability of Chinese equity markets and everything else. They want people to come to China, in part because they need the intellectual property, in part because they need the investment, because they need to have all of this growth. So I think they're going to want to make a deal in the short term. The question is whether the United States wants to make a deal. And I have a colleague, Marco Papich, or not a colleague, but former colleague who's a friend now.
He's coming on the podcast in a few weeks, actually.
Well, he's the one that's been saying, hey, there's a U.S.-China deal here, and you need the biggest anti-China guy in the room, Trump, in order to make the deal. And maybe that's what you get. I've been on the other side saying, I think actually maybe Trump is going to double down on some of these Chinese tariffs, and then we get into the scenario that you talked about. But if you get the deal, okay, maybe there's a reprieve here, and maybe things don't actually change that much for the rest of the world. So that's the first thing. And we've had some initial signals that maybe there is going to be some kind of deal. Also, I've been citing this paper that was published by a Cornell professor who's coming on my podcast soon. I'm forgetting his name off the top of my head, but he did this great study of who's going to be most negatively impacted by a trade war between the United States, Mexico, Canada, China. And maybe this is not an earth-shattering discovery, but I thought it was a really informative paper because he said, look, the United States is going to suffer less than those three countries if the United States puts tariffs on them. But you know who's going to win? All the countries outside of the trade war. You want to avoid trade wars as much as possible. So it's your Brazils and your Indias and your Turkeys. You are the ones that you're going to win if you can avoid the tariffs. Then Mr. Trump comes and says, okay, and here's steel and aluminum tariffs on everyone. So maybe he's trying to mess that up too, or maybe he has an impulse there as well. But I think we are speedily heading towards this multipolar world that I've been talking about for years now. And there's going to be a lot of opportunities out there, and countries that have been ahead of the curve on either vertically integrating or government support for industries that they could be competitive in, like your Brazils or your Indonesias. Those are places that are going to do well. And those are places that can play the big Olympian powers off of each other. Indonesia basically forced China to invest billions of dollars worth in factories and refining capacity and things like that in Indonesia. Other countries like Mexico are greedily looking at the U.S. and saying, hey, if you want to follow through on everything you're talking about, you're going to need us. You're going to need to manufacture those $2 shirts in Mexico rather than China in the future. So here's some tax breaks, and here's, we're going to do all these things for you on the security level. Like, you'll get those kind of spheres of influence. And then you'll get those countries outside who, like a Turkey or like a Brazil, that there's opportunity out there in the world for them, because suddenly they can play both sides off of each other, and suddenly it's good to be politically independent from that point of view. So I think that's how it works. And I think it's an opportunity for countries that are not the United States and China. I think it's easy to forget the countries that won the globalization era were the United States and China. They got the best of all worlds. They grew the most. I think it might be everybody else's turn now if the trade war really accelerates.
You brought up Marco. Do you subscribe to his constraints theory of geopolitics?
I think he wields it a little too religiously, but I think constraints are a wonderful thing to try and understand. It's important. This is the old Sherlock Holmes thing. Once you eliminate the impossible, whatever remains, however, improbable, must be the truth. So if you can take the impossible off the table, that's really good. I think one of the problems with thinking that constraints, though, are a be-all, end-all, and this, I think, is a problem for the geopolitics discipline in general, is that you don't always have in mind what the other guy is thinking, or if that person understands their constraints. Like, they might try and do something, even though you think you have an objective sense of what the constraint is, they might be wrong. And it's very hard for somebody who spends their life in analysis to be like, well, they can't see that they're wrong. Like, I can see it right here in my little office on my spreadsheet. They're wrong. They have to do the thing that I think is with the constraint. And I just don't think that works.
Let me interrupt to ask a quick favor. If you're watching on YouTube or listening as a podcast, please take a minute to subscribe to the channel. We're getting so close to 50,000 subscribers on YouTube, and every like and subscribe really helps. Thanks. Now back to the conversation with Jacob Shapiro.
The best example of this, and it's a depressing example, and it's one I think about a lot, is how the Korean War developed in the early 1950s. The Korean War, by the way, it's a poorly named war. The first 3 months were the Korean War. The rest of the war was really the first U.S.-China war. And it was just everybody on every side defying their constraints and deciding that maybe they could win. The United States thinking that it could just push all the way up to the Yalu River and China wouldn't respond. The constraint should have been, no, China's going to respond. MacArthur didn't care, and the U.S. kept pushing. China decided, we think we can push the U.S. back, and we're afraid of what they're doing around Taiwan, and we think we can win this conflict. That didn't work either. And what you ended up with was millions dead and a 3-year war where the line returned to where it was before the war started. So where was the constraint there? Everybody blew through the constraints because nobody recognized them. So I think constraints are really important, and they're really important to understand. But you also have to understand a person's psyche and whether the leaders who are actually calling the shots, whether they have the right constraints in mind, or whether they're going to try to do something that rubs up against the constraints, like a Vladimir Putin in Ukraine or something like that. So I subscribe to it, but like all things, everything in moderation, especially moderation.
My favorite story around constraints not working was a fairly famous investor who writes a well-distributed research letter. I'll leave his name out of it, but he was at a conference talking about how he thought that buying, this was many years ago, buying Puerto Rican energy bonds was a great deal because they were trading so far below par, and that it was in their constitution that they absolutely could not default. And so you were guaranteed by law to get paid back. So you could buy these bonds at whatever it was, 50 cents on the dollar, and you were going to get paid. You just had to kind of plug your nose and go for it. And then, of course, Puerto Rico defaulted, right, on those bonds. What makes me think of that is sort of what President Trump is doing now, right? Like I don't think that he acknowledges the constraints that most people thought he had.
And that's his superpower. He literally said this to the Wall Street Journal last year. Somebody at the Wall Street Journal asked him, are you afraid that Xi Jinping is going to make a move on Taiwan if you're elected president? And forgive me for cursing, but I'm quoting the president. He said, no, Xi Jinping knows I'm fucking crazy. Like, he wants people to think that he is nuts, that the constraints don't apply to him. He did this just a day or two ago in the Oval Office with the with the Hamas Israel ceasefire, where he's like, yeah, if they don't release the rest of the hostages by noon on Saturday, all hell's going to break loose. I mean, it's a nice soundbite. What the heck does that mean? Are you going to deploy the U.S. military? Like, are the Israelis going to, I mean, I don't know how they could bomb it any more than they already have. They're going to bomb it some more. Like, what are you talking about? But he wants people to think that he's unstable. And his superpower in some ways is actually what people see as constraints or norms on behavior. He says, no, that's a constraint for you because you can't see. You don't have the Trump power. You don't understand where we're going. I've got this. Like, we're gonna push forward. Everything is gonna be fine. Think of the announcement, what was it, a week or two ago? I can't remember when, because all time is running together, where he was like, yeah, we're going to start a sovereign wealth fund. Okay, like usually that's funded by a budget surplus. Where is this magical budget surplus? And he's like, oh, don't worry. Like, don't worry, we're going to figure it out. We're going to monetize the asset, physical asset side of the balance sheet or something like that. Or when he was talking about rebuilding Gaza, he's like, yep, we're going to rebuild it. It's going to be a great development. Other people, not us, they're going to put in lots of money and we're going to help manage it and everything's going to be great. It's like, oh, okay. Like I think that's his superpower in some ways, where most people see constraints. He hammers on the issue and then he resets the conversation or he resets the negotiation and things go from there. I think the problem for him is people are getting wise to it. You do it one too many times and then it's just going to be, okay, like give him the token win. He gets to declare victory. It's bad for the United States. It's good for the countries that negotiated with him. And then he'll be out of office and he'll be doing whatever he's doing at Mar-a-Lago.
Let's talk about probably the most sophisticated adversary that President Trump has, which is Vladimir Putin, I would argue. What happens in Ukraine? How does that conflict end? Is there a path evolving, and what do you see happening there, and what role might the U.S. play in that?
You're an optimist. Do you think that the conflict could end? It probably will never end. And certainly it's not, like, Ukraine is not of existential interest to the United States. It doesn't really matter to the United States. Everything that happens in Ukraine is going to be dependent on what Europe wants to do and what kind of Europe we're going to get here going forward and how Europe responds to President Trump or responds to President Putin. I take your point on Vladimir Putin. He's a very sophisticated, very cunning leader. You have to be around for as long as he has been. But Ukraine was a mistake. He believed that the Russian military had modernized itself after the Georgia invasion. Russia on paper kicked Georgia's butt, but there were actually a lot of lessons learned from that. Like, they couldn't get air and ground forces to communicate in a good way. And if they had been up against a real adversary, it wouldn't have gone well. They used that as a blueprint to fix the Russian military, and he thought it was fixed. And so he decided to blitzkrieg into Ukraine. He believed his own propaganda. He drank his own Kool-Aid, and suddenly he was up against Ukraine, which, when backed with Western weapons, he couldn't do anything with. And I said this in the week or two after the invasion, and I still think it's true. All Putin did by invading Ukraine was he turned Russia from a great power into a Chinese gas station. And that's what Russia is today. It's a Chinese gas station. Like, that's going to be its future, unless, Putin pulls some kind of rabbit out of his hat. But I don't think that's going to happen. I think that maybe Trump will want to get some kind of deal that he can, slap his brand onto. But the only way that Putin makes a deal is if he's forced to, or if he thinks he's losing. Now, I don't think he thinks he's losing. I think he thinks he's winning. He wants to take back Donbass. He thinks he can outsuffer the Ukrainians. He thinks eventually the West will get tired of this, whereas Russia won't. Maybe he gets some kind of ceasefire once he takes all of the Donbass, and then he rearms and regroups and tries to come back for it later. There's no incentive for him to stop right now, because the moment he stops, then the West can arm Ukraine, and maybe Ukraine becomes like a version of Israel inside of Europe, highly militarized with the best technology. It doesn't have to technically be in NATO, but everybody puts all their best tech there, and he can't do anything with it. So it seems to me he just has to keep mashing forward. So then can you get someone to force him to do it? And this is where it goes back to the three-dimensional or fourth-dimensional chess with China. If China called Vladimir Putin and said, "Yeah, we're going to stop buying Russian mineral commodities unless you reach a ceasefire in Ukraine. You've got 2 months," I bet he'd listen to that. And can Mr. Trump call Mr. Xi and say, "Hey, can you help me out here? You scratch my back, I'll scratch your back too." Like, that would be a really interesting version of that. I don't think that's going to happen for the record, but like when you start playing out the scenarios, that's the sort of thing that would have to happen. So I don't see any deal here. And if there is a deal, I think it's just going to be a superficial deal. I don't think it's actually going to end the conflict. I think we're stuck with Russia's going to take back those eastern parts of Ukraine. Western Ukraine will survive today as a rump state and probably in the future as a highly militarized state that pushes back against Russia in the long term. And like Putin's constraints will eventually eat him alive, probably. I think that's the direction we're going.
Can Europe have any influence on that?
Sure, but that's about how much of the bill that Europe wants to foot. And this is why, for me, the biggest signal in the world in Q1 is nothing. I mean, maybe we'll get something unexpected happen somewhere in the world. But the thing we know that is happening in Q1 is German elections. And I don't know if you read the Merz interview with The Economist, but this guy is center right. He's hawkish on Ukraine. He's saying all the right things. He's saying, let's move on the debt brake. Let's cut the red tape. Let's have European leadership. Let's boost military spending as quickly as possible. Let's cut all of these ridiculous subsidies. Let's cut back some benefits and things like that so we can actually get the economy growing again. If you can get a real Germany rising and real leadership inside the European Union, and then on top of that, you get Trump saying, we're going to do tariffs on Europe next, and you have a strong Germany that's like, okay, great, you try that. We'll go to Beijing or we'll go to these other places and see what's going to happen. Then that could be really interesting, and maybe there's an incentive there for Germany to lead and for Europe to back Ukraine. The flip side, of course, is if you've been an EU optimist for any meaningful period of time, as I have been for a couple of years, they continue to disappoint. They continue to find new and novel ways to be inefficient and bureaucratic and feckless and unsophisticated. So maybe it would all blow up in their minds, but it'll be really interesting to see what happens with German elections. Does Merz decide to work with the AfD? Could you get a CSU, CDU plus AfD 50% plus coalition? And does he have power then to do things? That version of Europe is much different than one that is just sort of sitting on its hands and doesn't know what to do.
So with a nod to Marko Papic then, what would his constraints be? I mean, and the first thing that comes to my mind is the auto industry in Germany and how China, I just read this morning that China's making sort of, German level quality cars, and they're now going to be adding in automation, automated driving enhancements, a la Tesla, for less than $15,000 US.
The constraint for Germany, it's going to be, what is the margin of victory? Can he build a coalition that is single-minded in pursuit of making the tough changes that Germany needs? You probably remember back in the late 90s when The Economist called Germany the sick man of the euro, and everybody said that Germany was caving in on itself and deindustrializing, and all these tropes, they're just being recycled from the late 90s. And what happened? You had a German government come in and you had the Hartz reforms, and you had some really tough decisions, and you had a lot of benefits that were cut for the German population, benefits that people weren't thought possible. And that led to a German economic miracle and Angela Merkel's chancellorship and Germany becoming the beating heart of the European Union and making the economists look silly for the 500 billionth time. That's the kind of inflection point we could be coming to here, where everybody says Germany's deindustrializing. Oh, they can't compete, not going to be able to do anything. They bet on cheap Russian energy. They're not going to have it anymore. What are they going to do? If you can get a government in there that is empowered to deliver some tough medicine and turn the German ship of state in a different direction, then maybe you can change things. Are you going to compete with China on cars? No. That's done. They already won electric vehicles. But what's next after electric vehicles? I'm not convinced electric vehicles are the future because of all the mineral commodities that need to go into the batteries that are going to do them. Is it hydrogen? Could you be at the center of, ammonia and ships? Maybe you're going to do a real big pivot and say, you know what, we're going to do nuclear reactors. We said we weren't going to do it, but now we're going to do nuclear reactors. If you read the Merz interview, he talks about how Germany needs to do nuclear reactors and build 50 gas plants in the next couple of years. When I start to hear those kind of commitments from Germany, I can hear the Teutonic Knights marching in the forest and the Panzer divisions revving up. When Germany decides it wants to do something, it'll do it. And there is still a remarkable amount of human capital and knowledge and areas of the global economy where Germany is first. But cars, yeah, the auto industry is done. The auto industry is cooked. I think they know that. So I'm sorry, you asked the constraint on Germany. The constraint is a German government elected with enough of a margin to deliver the harsh medicine? Because if it's not, if a Merz gets elected but he can't actually deliver the medicine, okay. And if the German auto industry is calling the shots rather than the German government saying, no, take the medicine so that we can survive in the future, then it's not going to look so pretty for the EU.
So what's your favorite little, if you can tell me this, what's your favorite pocket of the world for investing right now? Something that maybe is a little off the radar, or not in the mainstream narrative.
Yeah, it's tough. It's tough even to define the mainstream narrative because you can find somebody who loves everything, no matter how hard you look. I forget his name, but there was some guy who was like focusing on Iraq as like a place that was going to be the next big thing. He had like a whole fund based around it. Have you heard about this? So like you can find people there in general. I would have said Japan a couple of years ago, but now Warren Buffett's on that corner, so I can't say that without looking silly.
And India's stock market has been on fire to the point where you wonder, will it keep running?
There's two different questions there too. So from an equity market perspective, I think India and Turkey are really interesting places to take note of, because what's going on in both of those countries, for very, very different reasons, is that the normal retail consumer is buying stocks. India, because they want to be part of the growth story, and there's this vision about India transforming in the future. Turkey, because they had inflation over 60%, and they banned Bitcoin and other things. So if you wanted to keep pace with inflation, Turkish equities was probably your place to go. But you've got domestic folks that are buying up the stocks and driving up the stock. That's exactly what China wants to do. China would love it if people stopped buying third condos or putting their money underneath their mattress and say, no, I'm going to invest in Chinese companies. So there's something happening sort of from an animal spirits perspective in places like India and Turkey that I think is interesting, and maybe you can surf some of that wave. But the flip side, the pockets that I'm interested in the world right now, it's the ones that are going to benefit from things like multipolarity or a U.S.-China trade war. So two of the countries that I'm most interested in that I think are furthest along on this path are Brazil and Indonesia. Brazil's a little bit more mature in this sense. And Brazil honestly reminds me more of the United States than any other country in the world. When you think about they're becoming the low-cost producer for a lot of ag commodities that the U.S. used to have. They've got a lot of renewable energy, and Petrobras is sitting on a bunch of oil. Like they have some energy security that maybe they can throw around with. They got hollowed out from a manufacturing basis because of globalization in China, but they still have some really interesting manufacturing, and they're doing some important government and tax reform. Even if you're thinking about Lula squabbling with the government, like they've actually been able to push some really interesting things. Indonesia is another. This is a country of 250 million plus people. They've got a healthy demographic profile. They've got all sorts of critical mineral commodities that are important. They've got companies in China and Japan and South Korea eager to outsource for the cheap labor. Like you sort of go on down the list, like they've got a lot of the things. If you've got a really nice risk appetite, or if you had a billionaire come to me and say, hey, I got $1 billion, what's one idea you want? I would be like, let's book tickets to Argentina. Let's commit 5 million. Let's see what you could buy in real assets in Argentina, in Milei's transforming Argentina. Is it probably going to be a basket case? Sure. But he's doing things that haven't been done in Argentina in arguably a century. And Argentina is like the biggest, geopolitical underachiever maybe in history, like all the resources that they're sitting on and all the potential that could possibly be there. Like that's one where I think it'll take over a decade, but maybe you're at the very, very beginning of a turn there as well. So those are the types of markets and opportunities that I'm interested in. And in general, I'm more interested in international than I am in the United States. Like I think the United States has been leading the way for some time now. I think maybe international is going to step up. So.
Oh, interesting. So you think tech is going to stop driving U.S. markets?
Well, that's a different question, whether tech is going to stop driving U.S. markets. I think tech probably still drives U.S. markets, and that's where the United States has a big advantage. The other big advantage the United States has over many countries that we talk about here, especially China, is the United States has cheap energy, which is ironic when you think about like the last 40 years or 50 years of U.S. geopolitics has been energy insecurity. Actually, like we're doing pretty good on energy insecurity. Now it's the countries like China that are having to import from abroad or thinking about how they're going to deal with higher energy prices. So you put together ample energy supplies with, the data centers and all the things that you have to build in order to capitalize on AI and automation. Like the United States is sitting pretty there. The problem is, again, it goes back to making things. Like in order to make all of these things, you have to have good relations with some of these countries. Think about something as innocuous as telecoms gear. Let's go back to the first Trump administration and Huawei. You've got a U.S. company, Mavenir, that talked about trying to build some of this gear inside of the United States. And when they went in front of Congress and did a hearing, they talked about how all the radios and switches and things that go into cell towers, a grand total of 0% of it is made here. It's all made in Taiwan or South Korea or Japan or in China or things like that. So like we have all of these different advantages and we're at the commanding heights of so many different things, but but what about the switch that goes in the tower? Like, we literally don't have a supply chain for that is not connected to countries that apparently we're going to tariff. So, it's complicated there when it comes to tech. And I do think like the revenge of hardware might be coming, because no matter how glittering your prospects are in the tech space and in the cloud, like all the stuff is still like, you still need physical infrastructure. And unless we're going to get warp speed for some of these pieces, like, you're going to need some of these foreign countries that you're picking a fight with right now.
Jacob, always a pleasure speaking with you. What did I not ask you that I should have? What did we miss?
I think one of the biggest tendencies that I have to correct with whether it's a client or whether it's an audience that I'm speaking to is I'm not pessimistic. If anything, I'm very optimistic about opportunities that are out there. I think the way the media environment works right now, they've literally done studies where we like negative news. We click more on negative news. We read negative news articles for longer. I think Trump knows this better than everyone. I think he knows that he can just say stuff and he's going to soak up the attention in the room. I've noticed this particularly with U.S. papers or just English language press in general. I mean, you have to really dig before you get to the things that are going on in the world, because it's all Trump did this and Trump said this and Trump at the Super Bowl and Trump tariff. He said this, he tweeted. Like, there's a whole world out there. And if you go back to previous eras like this, the 1890s is the one that I like to compare it to, but there are plenty of others. These are times of incredible technological innovation, technological diffusion, cultural effervescence. Like, we're on a total energy regime change for the first time in 100 years. Like, there is an awful lot of opportunity out there. So my parting message to folks is first of all, turn off the clicks, turn off the social media, get out of the fetal position, and just get a little sober and look around and say, okay, well, if all this is happening, like, we need to build switches in telecoms towers, or we're going to need a lot more of this particular material, and nobody seems to realize that. I think those types of generational opportunities are out there if you don't get distracted by all the negativity. So what did we miss? I think we have a tendency to focus on the negative when change is a good thing if you can see through the change and have a clear and focused philosophy on how you're going to change that and how you're going to target that. And that's how I feel right now. I worry a lot about the world that my kids are going to inherit if we can continue on this trajectory, whether it's U.S. debt or the future of U.S.-China relations or global war. But for the next 5-10 years, like, these are the years of plenty. Like, prepare for the years of famine ahead by like making good decisions now. Like, don't make the mistake of thinking that now things are bad. Like, things are pretty good right now.
Yeah, and times of change are when you can make a lot of money. So you're out on the speaking circuit. How do people find you? Where do they learn more about you, Jacob?
Yeah, so the easiest way is jacobshapiro.com. I bought that web address 10 years ago, and apparently it was a good investment. So I wear a bunch of different hats now, but easiest is jacobshapiro.com, or email me at jacob@jacobshapiro.com, and you can find me in all the sorts of different hats that I wear.
Always a pleasure. Let's do this again soon, Jacob.
Sounds good. I'm here if you need me.
Thank you.